Alright everyone, so today we will be doing the 8th chapter of O-Level and IGCSE Computer Science, which is called Programming. Alright, so this will have a little bit of a different format. I have my IDE open here. Alright, this is PyCharm and we will be using Python language to study this chapter. Alright, so I'll basically be writing down the functions and variables on this side of the screen, and I'll be performing a few things over here. And if you want to follow along, you can download this from your web browser, and you can download Python as well, and if you want to, you can do this along with me as well. Alright, so let's begin with the first few topics. So the first topic that we're going to do today are variables and constants. Alright, so I've actually told you about variables and constants before as well, but I'll explain it to you again. Alright, so in Python we don't actually differentiate between variables and constants. Alright, so we just have normal constants, normal variables. Alright, so over here you can see that if I want to make a variable, I just write down the name of the variable, right, and then I write down whatever I want to store inside of it after the equals to. Right, and let's just say that this variable is now completed. Right, I have stored a value inside that variable, and now I want to print whatever is inside of that variable. All right, so I will use a function that is called print. All right, and then I will do, and when I run this, you can see that we are printing Note Academy, right, which is actually stored inside of name. So this is basically what variables are. All right, so constants are basically just values that once they actually contain a value, they cannot be changed. All right, so this is not actually a part of Python. Right, Python does not have anything to mimic constants. All right, however, we do have constants in pseudocode. So over here you can see that we have to write down constant in block letters, and then we have to write down the name of the constant and assign it the value when we are declaring it. Right, so over here you can see that if you want to make a variable, you have to write down two lines. Right, you have to declare that variable. Right, we have to write down its name, then we put a colon over here, and then we give the data type. Right, so after we have done this, now we will actually be able to store a value inside this variable. Right, however, that is not the case with Python. You don't have to declare anything, you can just simply write down the value after the name of the variable. All right, so let's move on to the second topic, which is just the basic data types. All right, so over here you can see that we have 5 basic data types that are included in our syllabus in pseudocode. Right, integer, which is just normal numbers; real, which are decimal numbers which have points in them; and then we have string, which is just text; and then we have character, which it basically means that we can only store one character in that variable; and then we have a boolean value, which basically means that there can only be two different possible values that can be stored in that variable. Right, for example, true or false, or yes or no, 1 or 0, any of those things. All right, so if you actually want to declare something and inside pseudocode, you will basically have to write down a line that will declare the type, and then you will have to store that value inside that variable. However, in the case of Python, we don't actually need to declare anything. You can see here that they all follow the same format. Right, you can just write down the whatever kind of value you want to store by itself. You don't actually have to declare anything. All right, so now let's move on to input and output. So in order to input and output inside pseudocode, we can just use the keywords output and the keyword input. All right, you don't actually need to do anything else. However, in Python it is a little bit different. Right, so let's see how Python works. So let's just say that we want to take an input from the user. I will use the input function, and then I will write down a statement that it will output when we are asking for an input from the user. Alright, so then I'll just simply run this so that you can understand what we mean by this. So over here you can see that enter your name is the same line that we want to output over here as well. Alright, and when we want to enter something, I'll just write down the name. For example, I'll just write down Note, and when I enter this, you can see that nothing else happens because it has stored that inside name. Right, so if I want to output this, I'll just simply use the function print. Right, and I'll just say print name, and you can see that when we run it and when we enter the name Note, you can see that it is now going to output Note, right, because that was what we sent as input. All right, So this is basically how you do input and output in pseudocode and Python. So now let's move on to selection statements. All right, so this is a little bit interesting. All right, so first of all, I've already done these in chapter 7. So if you want to look at the pseudocode of these things, you will have to go back to chapter 7. All right, so over here you can see that the if else statements is almost in the exact same way as it was inside pseudocode. However, there are a few differences. All right, so first of all, let's just make a small example. All right, so if name is equal to note, I will just try to output that this is a success, right? But if the name is not note, right, so in order to actually output something for any other possibility, I'll just use else and then I'll print fail. All right, so that is basically how you create a simple if statement. All right, so now I will just run this. All right, so it is asking for my name. I write down note over here. All right, so you can see that it is going to print success, right? Why? Because over here when we were giving it the input of name, right, that name is the same as this note over here, right? So this string is the same as this string, right? So another thing that I want you to notice here is that we are using double equals to, right? We are actually doing this because over here you can see that when we want to assign a value to a variable, we use a single equals to, and if you want to compare something, right, if you want to see if something is equal to another thing, you will have to use double equals to. Another thing that you need to note here is that we are using colons at the end of if statement and the else statement, right? And lastly, you can see that print success and print fail are both in different indents, right? So they have been given indentations after if, right? They're not in the same line as if and else. So let's take another example of if we want to print fail. So if I write anything else, right, and I enter this, you can see that it will print fail, because if there is any other option, if this condition is not met, right, it will do whatever is inside else. All right, so this is what we mean by if else statements. So now let's come down to match case statements. So the match case statement is basically just the alternative to case of statement inside pseudocode. All right, so if I want to enter, let's just say we're talking about grades now, right, this will be a little bit easier to understand. I'll just write down match and then grade. All right, I'll use a colon over here just like an if statement, then I write down the first case. So let's just say that I want to write down a case for A. I'll print that your grade is equal to A, right? And then we'll give it another case where the case is about B. All right, we give a colon and then we write down print your grade is equal to B. All right, and for any other case, right, so if you remember that in case of statements we actually used a keyword otherwise, right? So rather than writing otherwise, we use a case underscore in Python, right? So case underscore and we write down print, and you can just write down fail. All right, so now let's just test this. So if you want to enter, actually I'll just change this. All right, enter your grade. Now let's run this again. So if you want to enter your grade, let's just say that we're going to enter A over here. You can see that we get grade is equal to A, right? However, if I enter anything else, you can see that we will get fail over here, right? So basically, if the first two cases, or if the initial cases are not met, this case, which is the case underscore, is the one that will have to be used. All right, so print fail is what was printed when we were testing this. So this is basically just a small example of match case statement. All right, so let's talk about loops. So first of all, we have a simple for loop. All right, so for loop is basically just a count control loop, which means that it only runs a certain number of times. All right, so in pseudocode we actually just wrote down for I 1 to 10, right, which is relatively easier to what we are going to do in Python. All right, so over here we actually write down for x in range 10. All right, so let's write this down, and let's just say that if you want to print something, maybe n dash. All right, let's just print n dash over here. So Rather than printing and dash, I think I'll just print x over here so you can actually understand the concept as well. All right, so let's run this thing. So over here you can see that the output that we're getting starts from 0, all right, and it goes till 9. So one thing that I want you to notice over here is that first of all, everything in Python, right, even the indices inside an array or a list, if you recall, in pseudocode we were actually starting a list from 1 and we're going forward to each index, right? However, in Python we will actually start lists and arrays from 0, and in this case as well you can see that the range is basically starting from 0. All right, and another thing that I want you to notice is that it is not including 10, right? If you want to include 10 inside of this, you will actually have to write down 11, right? And when I run this again, you can see that we are now printing 10. All right, so always remember that when you are using this range function, it will not include the last value. All right, so this is just a small example of how for loops work in Python. So let's move on to precondition loops, which are just while loops. All right, so let's talk about while loops. So in order to explain while loops, I'll just create a simple variable and I'll give it the value of x. Then I will create a simple while loop. So let's just say that when while is less than 9, I want you to print whatever the value of x is. All right, and then I want you to increment x. All right, so increment basically means that I'm increasing the value of x by 1. All right, so let's run this and see what happens. So over here you can see that we get an output from 0 till 8. All right, so what is happening here is that first of all, when we enter this loop, right, it will check the value of x. So x initially was 0, right? So then it will just simply print the value of x because that condition was met, therefore we entered the loop. So it will just print the value of x, which is 0, right? So it starts from 0 and then it will add 1 to the value of x, right? So because this condition was still true, it will go again and it will check this condition again. All right, so it sees that now the value of x is 1, right, which is still true. So now it will print x again and then increment this again. So in the last time it will basically just see that if the value becomes 9, right, it will check that if 9 is less than 9 or x is less than 9, that will basically not be true, and then therefore we basically break out of the loop, right? It does not print value 9. All right, so that is basically how a while loop works. So now let's come down to string handling. All right, so string handling is also very easy. So I've actually already explained this to you before as well in pseudocode. So over here you can see that we use a function by the name of length, right? So length in block letters, and then we write down whatever we want to find the length of, and it'll simply just give us the output, right? So this is also almost the same inside Python, however with a little bit of a different name. All right, so if I want to print the length of Note Academy, right, I'll just write it down and you can see that when I run this I get the value 12. All right, so if I just wrote down len Note Academy, right, so len is basically the function that we use to find the length. It will just simply maybe store the value 12 somewhere else, but it will not print it on the console, right? So in order to actually see it on the console, you will have to enclose it inside this print function. All right, so let's move on to substrings. So substrings basically mean that you are going to extract a part from a whole string. All right, so this is actually also very easy. So let me just give you an example. So let's just say that we have a variable that is called name. It has the string Note Academy inside of it. All right, and I want to print just Note. All right, so I'll just take name and I'll use square brackets to indicate the indices that I want to use. So let's just say 0 to 4. All right, so 0 to 4 with a colon in between. So now when I run this, you can see that I get Note over here. All right, so now I'll just show you something that you might find interesting. So first of all, when I write down 3 over here, you can see that if this index is basically starting from 0, right, so n is at 0, 0, o is at 1, t is at 2, and e is at 3, right? So when I run this, you can see that I only get not over here. Why? Because as I told you before in range function as well, that the last value is not actually included in this. All right, so if I want to include the last e inside this string as well, I will write down 0 to 4. All right, and now we get note. All right, so always remember that the last value is not actually included. All right, so now let's move on to uppercase and lowercase. So let's just say that I want to make this name uppercase. All right, so if we're talking about pseudocode, you can see that we just have to use a simple function called ucase for uppercase and lcase for lowercase. However, in Python, it is a little bit different. So if I want to turn it into uppercase, I'll just use a method that is dot upper and round brackets. All right, so now when I run this, you can see that I get Note Academy over here. All right, and if I want to turn it into lowercase, I will have to do lower. All right, and when I run this, you can see that I get lowercase Note Academy. All right, so this is just a simple example of lowercase and uppercase inside Python. So I just need you to remember that we don't actually use a function to turn it into lowercase and uppercase. We use a method which is basically just a dot, the name of the method, and then its own round brackets which are empty. So now let's move on to a few operators. Alright, so the operators are mostly the same as in pseudocode. However, there are a few differences in Python. Alright, so first of all, over here you can see that raised to the power is represented by this small arrow. Alright, however, in Python it has two sterics. So let me just give you an example over here really quick. So let's just say that we have a number that is 2 raised to the power 3, right? And I want to print this number, right? So if I want to print this number, and now when I run this, you can see that we get a value 8, right? So we get the value 8 over here. So in order to do 2 raised to the power 3, you will use 2 steric. And over here, another difference you can see is that equal in pseudocode is represented by just 1 equals to. However, in Python it is 2 equals to, and also not equal to is represented with two I don't know, pointy brackets, and over here Python is representing it with an exclamation mark and an equal to. Alright, so make sure that you remember these small differences. Also, you need to note here that if you want to use and, or, and not inside Python, you will have to write them down in lowercase rather than in uppercase like pseudocode. So now let's talk about the interesting parts, which are subroutines, right? Functions and procedures. So basically, first of all, I'll just tell you what a subroutine is, right? So like functions and procedures both come under the heading of subroutines. So subroutines are basically just a program that performs a frequently used operation within a program, all right? And it can be called whenever it is needed and can be reused. All right, so basically what we're doing here is that we're writing down a bunch of stuff underneath one single name, and we want to basically use that bunch of stuff. We will just call that single name, use that single name instead of writing down the whole thing again. And this is how we basically make sure that we are very efficient in writing our programs, and we are not actually just repeating a lot of stuff again and again. All right, so functions and procedures really help us write programs. So a difference between function and procedures are basically just that functions will always return a value. Alright, so this is just the only difference between functions and procedures. Functions will always return a value, whereas procedures never return a value. So let's talk about procedures first. Alright, so if you want to create a procedure and a function inside pseudocode, you can see here that we use different keywords. Alright, so for procedure we use procedure and end procedure, whereas for functions we use function and end function. All right, however, in the case of Python, we don't actually need to have different keywords. We just have a simple keyword which is def. All right, so let's just start with a simple procedure that is without parameters. All right, so let's just say that I want to create a procedure called greetings. All right, and I want to make it print this line, right? It's hello, and this is Note Academy. All right, so let's just say that I wanted to do this. So rather than just writing this line every single time, I will basically just call greetings by just writing down greetings. All right, also make sure that you don't forget these two brackets. And now when I want to run this, you can see here that this will print this line. All right, So this is basically how you can do this. So if I want to maybe call that again, I'll just control C this, right, and control V this, and when I run this again, you can see that it will write this line 2 different times. All right, so this is basically how procedures help us make things easier for us. So anyways, let's come down to procedures with parameters. So let's create a simple procedure called multiplication. All right, and this will basically help us to multiply two different things. All right, so let's just have two parameters, a and b. All right, and let's just make them print the multiplication of these two values. All right, so over here you can see that the parameters that are used are basically a and b. All right, and those are the same ones that are used to refer inside of the procedure as well when I'm defining that procedure. All right, however, when I actually want to use this, I will not just write down I'll not actually write down a and b. I'll use actual values. All right, so let's just say I use 8 and 9. Right, so 8 times 9 is basically 72. All right, and this is the answer that we get. So over here you can see that 8 will be multiplied by 9. All right, so that is just a simple example of a procedure with parameters. And also another thing that I think you should know here is that these procedures in Python do not have an end statement, right? It does not have an end def. Like in procedures in pseudocode, you can see that procedure has an end statement, which is end procedure, right? Python does not have that. You just need to make sure that you're indenting whatever you want to write inside of this procedure or function. So now let's move on to simple functions. All right, so in order to create a function, you need to remember that functions always return a value. All right, so in pseudocode you need to specify what value it will actually return when you are defining it. All right, so you can see in the header of the function, so the first line of a function is basically called the header of the function, right? So over here you can see that inside this you are actually writing the data type that will actually return. Another thing that you need to note here is that it is actually returning whatever value there is, right? It uses the return keyword, right? So that is just basically how you use functions and procedures inside pseudocode. All right, however, we will do it in Python now. So let's just say that we have this same procedure. However, rather than printing this, I'll just say that you have to return this. All right, so now when I run this, you can see that we don't actually get any output, right? This is because we're not printing the output. We are actually getting this output. However, we cannot print this on the console. So in order to print this on the console, I will use the print function. All right, and you can see here that now I will be able to get 72, right? So basically when you return a value, it is being stored. However, it is not being used currently inside the console. It is not actually being shown to us. All right, so let's just say that I want to create a variable, right, num1, and I want to multiply whatever the multiplication of 3 and 9 is by 3 again. All right, 8 and 9 with 3 again. So now when I run this, you can see that we don't actually get anything. All right, however, when I print num1, you can see that we get the value 216, which is actually 3 times 72. All right, so this is basically a small example of how return keywords work inside functions inside pseudocode and Python. All right, so one more thing that you need to note here is that when you want to call a function inside Python, you just simply write down the name of the function and whatever parameters you have to inside the bracket. However, in pseudocode you have to write the keyword call as well. All right, so make sure that you remember this. So now let's move on to local and global variables. All right, so this is also a very simple example. So let me just write this whole thing down and then I'll explain it to you. Alright, so now we have a simple example of local and global variables. Alright, so let me just call this function over here, which is example1, so that you can actually see the difference between them. Alright, so now when I run this file, you can see that it will print global variable, which I already did over here, and then it will move on to this function, which is printing local variable and then the global variable. All right, however, let's just say that I want to access that local variable outside of the function. when I run this, you can see that we will get an error. All right, this is because the name local1 is not defined. All right, so this basically means that because we actually use local1 inside of the function, we cannot actually use it outside of the function, right? So if you create a variable that is inside of a function, you cannot use it outside of the function. All right, so this is just a small example of local and global variables. So now let's move on to library routines. Alright, so this is also a very easy concept. So first of all, there are 4 different things inside pseudocode. Alright, so first of all, we have mod, which is basically going to return the remainder. We have div function, which will return the quotient. We have a round function, which obviously rounds it to the certain type of decimal place that you have specified. And then we have a random function, which will generate a random number. All right, so let's go through these. So in Python, they are a little bit different. All right, so let's just say that we have a value that is 7, and I want to take the mod of 7 and 3. All right, so rather than using a function, we'll just simply use the percentage sign. All right, so the percentage sign is basically what is used for mod. So when I basically print value 1, you will see that we get the answer 1. All right, so the remainder when we divide 7 with 3 is 1, obviously. And if I want to divide this, right, you will not use a function like in pseudocode. We will actually use double forward slash, and you can see here that we get 2. All right, so 7 divided by 3 is just simply 2. So next, you can see that I've given an example of the div mod function. If you want to, you can use this. However, I do not really recommend that you do this because I've already shown you other ways. All right, so now we have the round function. All right, so let's just say that I have a value over here which is pretty large. All right, and it is in numbers. All right, now I want to basically round this, so I will basically use the round function. All right, I will enclose it in brackets, and I'll specify how many decimal places I want. All right, so in my case, I want to be in 2 decimal places. So you can see that when I run this, I get 56.46 as the answer, which is correct. All right, so lastly, we have to introduce a random number. All right, so in order to create a random number, we will basically import a library. All right, so libraries are basically pre-written functions, right? So before we will actually writing functions on our own, right? So these are basically just functions that are already written, however they're stored in another file somewhere else on the computer. All right, so in order to actually use those functions, we have to make sure that we're actually referencing that library routine. All right, so from random, which is the name of the library, import random. All right, so this will just make sure that we are actually using that library. All right, so now I want to basically create a random number, so I'll just use random over here. All right, and now when I print value 1, you can see that I will get the value that is random over here, right? 0.20957. right? So you can basically multiply by 100 or whatever you want to do with these values, round it down so that you can actually use it according to your use case. All right, so this is how you do use libraries inside pseudocode and Python. Alright, so now coming down to arrays and file handling. Alright, so these are the 2 last topics that we'll study today. So first, let's study about arrays. Alright, so arrays are basically just the list that we were talking about before. Alright, so over here we can see that we have basically 2 different kinds of arrays: one-dimensional array and two-dimensional arrays. Alright, so one-dimensional and two-dimensional arrays. So let's just study one-dimensional array first. Alright, so in one-dimensional arrays, in order to do this in pseudocode, you basically have to declare the name of the array. All right, after the colon, we write down array. All right, and inside the square brackets, we write down the limits. So over here, you can see that we are introducing the limits from 0 till 3. All right, so they're basically going to be 4 different values inside this array. And then we write down of and integer, which is basically just the data type that will be stored inside this array. So over here you can see that if you want to write down the values inside each index, you will have to do it separately. All right, so over here, once you've done this and we want to output this, we will use a for loop which will go from 0 to 3 and output each index in the array. However, in Python it is a little bit easier. All right, so if you want to create an array inside Python, we use something called lists. Alright, so in Python we don't actually have arrays, we just use lists inside. So this will obviously use square brackets, alright, and we will write down the values, let's say 3, 4, 7 and 2, alright. And if you want to print this, you will just simply say array1. You don't need to use a for loop like in pseudocode, and you can see that it just prints the whole list. Alright, so this is basically how you use lists inside of Python. Now let's move on to two-dimensional arrays. So the declaration of two-dimensional arrays is a little bit different. So over here you can see that in the square brackets we tell him the first limit, which is from 0 to 2, which means that there are going to be 3 rows. We use a comma over here, and then we write down 0 to 1, which is basically the number of columns. Alright, there are going to be 2 columns and 3 rows over here. So this is how it will basically look. Alright, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Alright, so these are the columns and these are the rows. Alright, so this is basically how this array will basically look like. Alright, so let's try to recreate this in Python. So in order to actually do this in Python, we will just use the same array. Alright, however, we will create an array inside of that array. Alright, so we will, when you're first writing this down, we use a single square bracket. Now we will use 2 square brackets, make an array. Alright, so let's just say 1, 2, and then we use another array with the comma 3, 4, and we write down another array which is 5, 6. Alright, and you can see here that we get a two-dimensional array, and in order to print it, you just have to simply say array1, and this will basically print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Alright, however, in pseudocode you can see that it is a little bit different. You have to use 2 for loops, one for the rows, one for the columns, and then you use the output keyword to actually output the arrays. Alright, so this is how this works inside pseudocode. So now let's move on to the next topic, which is file handling. Alright, so this is a little bit tricky, so make sure that you're listening very carefully. So let me just explain the code that I've written over here in pseudocode. So basically what we want to do here is that we want to create a text file. Alright, we want to write a line inside the text file, and then when we actually close that text file, and let's just say that we want to access some other file, I want to read whatever is inside that file. Alright, so this is basically what we're doing generally. So let's see how we actually have to do this. First of all, I need you to create 2 variables. Alright, so you can see here that I've created 2 variables, line1 and file1. Alright, so file1 will basically just store the exact address of that file. Alright, so whatever file we want to access, we will store its exact address over here. Right, next we will open that file for write. So if this file does not actually exist, you will see that the PC will actually create this file for you. Alright, so first of all, in order to open this file, we just say open file1, which is actually noteacademy.txt, for write. Alright, we're opening it in write mode. So over here we basically just have 2 modes, write mode and read mode. Alright, so let's study about write mode first. So over here we're basically just taking an input from the user, and then when we actually want to write that line to the file, you can see here that we'll use the keyword write file, name of the file, which is file1, use a comma, and then we write down the line itself. Alright, so line 1 is basically whatever was input by the user and what actually had to be stored inside the file. Alright, then we will always remember to close that file. Alright, so always remember, because this is actually one of the small things that candidates usually forget to use. So always remember that you have to close a file when you're using file handling in a question. Alright, next we want to read a line from a file. Alright, so first of all, I would obviously write the name of the file after open, and then we will open it in read mode. Alright, so for read. Next we will have to use the keyword read file. Alright, and then we will write the name of the file, and then we will just store whatever we have to read inside line 1. Alright, so this is actually just reading whatever is inside that file and storing it inside line 1, and then we will output line 1 to actually see what line 1 contains, and then we will obviously remember to close the file. So this is basically how you read and write inside files in pseudocode. Now let's move on to Python. So let me just write this down over here for you, and then I'll just explain it to you. Alright, so let's talk about this. So first of all, you can see here that in order to open this file, we use a function called open. Alright, so we will open this file inside a variable called file1, and then we will use a variable called line1 to actually take an input from the user. So once we've actually taken that input from the user, we will write that inside file1 using a method. Alright, so I've actually shown you two methods before, dot upper and dot lower. However, in this case we're actually using the open brackets, the round brackets, and writing down whatever we actually want to write inside that file, and then we obviously use the dot close method to close the file. When we want to open a file and read from that file, we will use the open function, then we will open it in read mode, right? So over here we are actually using R, which indicates the read mode. Over here we are using W, which indicates the write mode. All right, then we will actually read from that file and we will store that inside the variable line1, right? And then in order to actually output that, we will use the print function, and then we will just close the file. All right, so let's run this and see what happens. So over here, when I want to enter the line, let's just say I want to say line1, you can see that it will print whatever was stored inside the line. All right. Alright, so another thing that I want to show you here is that these files actually are stored somewhere, right? So over here you can see that inside where my other Python files are stored, we have a new text file which is noteacademy.txt. Alright, so when I open this up, you can see that it has line1 written inside of it. Alright, so this is basically how these things actually work. Alright, so this is pretty much it for this chapter. Alright, so I hope that you like this video. Make sure to like my videos and subscribe to my channel, and I will be uploading more videos more often. Also make sure that you share these with your other friends who are studying the same subject. Alright, I'll see you later.